Carl Jung, Why Ignoring Your Shadow is Destroying Your Life. Your shadow controls you. Have you ever asked yourself, why do I keep falling into the same pain? You've studied, you've grown, you've tried to move on, yet somehow the same old pain returns just in a different face, a different situation, but with that same familiar ache. It's not because you're weak. It's because there's a deeper part inside you, one no one ever taught you how to face, the shadow. The shadow isn't something bad. It's made of memories you once rejected, repressed emotions, unnamed wounds, parts of yourself you hid just to be accepted. As long as you don't listen to the part that's been forgotten, life will keep repeating, not to punish you, but to awaken you. And if you're tired of repeating the same cycle, then maybe this isn't the end. Maybe it's the beginning of finally living as your true self. When you don't understand why you keep repeating the same pain, have you ever asked yourself, why do I keep falling into the same mistakes, the same familiar pain, even though I've tried so hard to change? You read books, listen to podcasts, and try to improve yourself, yet somehow you end up right back where you started, feeling disappointed, anxious, lost, or worse, hating yourself. There's something no one ever taught you. External effort alone won't save you from that cycle. What you need to confront isn't outside. It's within your own mind. What's running your life isn't logic, nor willpower. It's the fragmented parts of your past you've rejected, wounds that have never been named, parts of you that were forced into silence simply because they weren't socially acceptable. And if you don't know how to turn inward and face them, you'll spend your entire life being controlled. Carl Jung called this shadowy part the shadow, the unconscious darkness you carry within. It's not evil. It's the part that has never been acknowledged. It's the anger you were forced to swallow, the feelings of inadequacy you always denied, the jealousy you never dared admit, the inner self-blame you hear daily, but mistake for normal thoughts. And what happens then? You repeat old behaviors. You fall for the wrong people. You miss out on opportunities. You give up right before success, not because you're weak, but because a part of you believes you're unworthy of good things. No one told you that the more you suppress the shadow, the stronger it becomes. And when it gets strong enough, it takes the wheel, while you sit in the back, wondering, why is everything like this? This isn't meant to scare you, but to awaken you. The repetition is not failure. It's a sign that there's something within you that has never been touched, a part that was severed, waiting for you to return. And that is where the real journey begins. Not to become a better person, but to become yourself, more whole and more free than ever before. Are you ready to look into the place you've avoided? Because if you are, what comes next will change the way you understand yourself forever. Where does the darkness inside you begin? From a very young age, you learn to divide the world into two. What is praised should be kept, and what is criticized should be hidden. You learned how to appear obedient, sweet, and competent, because that's what gets you love. As for emotions like anger, jealousy, competition, or disappointment, you were taught that those shouldn't exist. And because you weren't allowed to express them, you pushed them deep inside, into the unconscious. Carl Jung called this the shadow, a psychological darkness formed by all the parts of yourself you once rejected. But the shadow isn't simply about badness. It holds everything you once felt, once wanted to express, but had to hide in order to be accepted by society. And the key point is this: you didn't hide them consciously, you hid them because you were taught to. A child who is scolded for being selfish when holding on to their toy learns that their needs are wrong. A child told stop crying learns that emotions are shameful. Little by little, you stop living as who you are and start living as the shadow of expectations. Those parts don't disappear. They're repressed, accumulated, and form the shadow within your soul. And the older you get, the further you drift from your true self, instead becoming a socially accepted version that doesn't actually belong to you. Have you ever felt tired from constantly pretending to be okay? Have you ever behaved in automatic ways while feeling empty inside? That's not you. That's the shadow you put on to survive. The irony is, the more loved that shadow version becomes, the more afraid you are of losing it, and you begin to forget who you were before you learn to please the world. The shadow isn't formed in a day, it's built from thousands of rejections, tens of thousands of judgmental looks, and countless moments when you were forced to be good. Now, to step out of unconscious control, you need to go back and ask, when did I start rejecting myself? And more importantly, am I brave enough to name the part of me that's been forgotten? Darkness is not a terrifying place. It's simply a place that's never been listened to, and perhaps what you've been seeking all along, inner freedom, self-truth, meaning in life, lies right within the part you've most wanted to hide. How the shadow silently controls everyday life. You might think you're the one in control of your life. You make decisions, take action, and accept responsibility. But here's what most people don't realize. A great deal of what you do daily doesn't come from consciousness. It comes from the unconscious, specifically from your shadow. The shadow doesn't arrive like a loud storm. It operates quietly, behind masks you've come to believe are just your personality or natural reactions. And it's precisely this silence that makes you never question it. You think it's you, when in fact it's the repressed parts of your past trying to surface in other forms. Have you ever felt irritated by someone who's too confident, frustrated, seeing others succeed, harshly judged people who express emotions freely? Those reactions don't come from logic. They come from parts of yourself that were once forbidden, parts that wanted to express but were suppressed. Now, you see them in others, and those emotions rise up as reflections. The shadow also explains the inner contradictions you experience. You want success but procrastinate. You crave love but push people away. You long to be authentic but fear vulnerability. That's your shadow pulling in the opposite direction, dragging you back to the familiar emotional territory of your childhood, a place that feels safe but suffocating. It shows up in how you choose friends, lovers, even your job. It appears in the words you use that hurt others, in the times you give up saying, "What's the point?" Every time you ignore your emotions, every time you force yourself to please others, you feed the shadow a little more. And then you fall into the state of not understanding yourself. You ask, why do I act like this? Why can't I control my emotions? Why do I keep doing things that hurt me? These questions are internal cries, pleas from the shadow you've neglected. Recognizing the shadow's existence is one step, but what's more important is realizing that it's controlling you, even when you think you're being rational. So don't blindly trust every reaction you have. Step back and ask, where is this reaction coming from? From my true self? Or from an unhealed wound? Because only when you realize you're being controlled can you start reclaiming agency. And once you're aware of that, you're no longer a victim of the unconscious. You've begun the journey of awakening. How the shadow controls you. Projection and self-sabotage. There are two major unconscious mechanisms the shadow uses to manipulate your life. Projection and self-sabotage both operate silently but powerfully, enough to determine who you love, what you lose, and whether you live as a victim or as someone free. Projection happens when you see in others what you can't face in yourself. A person who denies their own selfishness might be easily angered when others act in self-interest. Someone taught to be humble might resent those who defend themselves. The intense emotions you feel don't come from the other person. They come from a rejected part of yourself. The more you reject a particular emotion, the more likely you are to see it in others. And to harshly judge it, you don't realize that you're having a conversation with yourself through the image of someone else. That's why some people make you uncomfortable from the very first look, even though they've done nothing wrong. It's because they unintentionally trigger a locked-away emotional zone within you. The shadow doesn't just project outward. It distorts your perception of people, skews relationships, and traps you in cycles of judgment and hurt. The second, equally dangerous mechanism is self-sabotage. Have you ever been on the verge of getting what you wanted, a great job, a beautiful relationship, a rare opportunity, and then you pulled back? Have you kept delaying, avoiding, making excuses not to act? Or maybe you caused drama, let things fall apart, and then told yourself, see, I knew I couldn't do it. That's the shadow taking over. You sabotage yourself not because you're weak, but because a deep unconscious belief says you're undeserving. Maybe someone once told you, you'll never amount to anything, or rejected you when you tried to be yourself, and the shadow remembers. It becomes the gatekeeper of your safety zone. pulling you back every time you try to cross the threshold, even when what lies ahead is beautiful. The painful truth is, sometimes, we choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar joy simply because pain feels safer, and we don't believe we can live any other way. Once you understand these two mechanisms, you begin to see it's not the world working against you, it's the part of you that you haven't yet understood pulling you down. And here's the good news. If you've been unconsciously controlled, you can now start to see it. And once you see it, you can begin to change, not by forcing yourself to be positive, but by having the courage to go back and dialogue with what was once abandoned. That is the first step toward true freedom. Why do you keep attracting painful relationships? Have you ever wondered, why do I keep ending up with the same type of person in relationships? Even if the face changes, the feelings of disappointment, pain, abandonment are all too familiar. It's as if you're loving different people with the same soul, the soul of repetition, of unresolved wounds. This isn't coincidence. It's the effect of the shadow in your emotional and intimate life, and it works more powerfully than any logical advice you've ever heard. The shadow doesn't just carry repressed emotions. It holds your earliest experiences of love and pain. If your childhood was marked by abandonment, insecurity, or rejection, you'll unconsciously seek out similar situations to reenact what's familiar. You don't do this because you want pain, but because your unconscious believes, if this time I can be accepted in the same environment that once rejected me, maybe I'll finally heal. Sadly, that rarely happens. You're drawn to those who don't make you feel safe, because that's the emotional pattern you knew as a child. You cling to those who are cold, controlling, or dismissive, because that's the attachment style modeled by your family, and you repeat the cycle, hoping for a different ending, but that ending never comes, because the shadow is making the choices for you. The shadow doesn't just choose who you love, it also defines the role you play in the relationship. Some always become the rescuer, carrying all the emotions for the other person. Some are always the abandoned one in both romantic and platonic relationships. Others can never truly get close. They always create distance, because closeness reminds them of a vulnerability they were taught to fear. Worse, you start to think this is your type or your romantic fate. But it's not. It's repeated behavior from an unconscious wound left unhealed. And the most dangerous part, you begin to define yourself through your pain. You believe you don't deserve real love. You think you're always the one left behind. That belief isn't true, but the shadow makes you live as if it were. So stop and ask, what do I truly want in a relationship, and what inside me keeps choosing the opposite? When you ask this, not from blame, but from a sincere desire to understand, you begin to open the door out of the cycle, because only when you're willing to face the root pain in your unconscious can you begin to choose differently for the first time from a place of true awareness. You are not cursed by love. You simply need to reclaim your power of choice from the hands of the shadow within, and that journey begins with one honest look inward. 5 signs that the shadow is quietly controlling you. Not everyone realizes that they're being guided by their psychological shadow. The shadow doesn't scream, it doesn't warn, and it doesn't name itself. It seeps into your habits, your reactions, your choices, and daily emotions, as if it is you. But if you observe closely, you'll notice certain patterns that show it's the shadow at the wheel, not your conscious awareness. Constantly feeling judged. Even when no one says anything, you walk into a room and instantly feel scrutinized. You post something online and worry about what others might think, even without proof. You live in a state of defensiveness. This suggests a shadow filled with shame and insecurity, shaped by a past where you were judged, criticized, or denied your true self. Sabotaging good opportunities, achievements, or relationships. You get close to something you deeply want, and suddenly lose motivation, procrastinate, or create unnecessary conflict later. You justify it by saying, it wasn't right, or the timing was off. But the truth is, part of you fears change, fears success, or believes you're not worthy. This is the shadow's self-sabotage mechanism at work. Repeating painful relationship patterns. You keep attracting people who make you feel small, unsafe, or emotionally dependent, Even though you know it's unhealthy, you can't break free. That's because the shadow is recreating early emotional templates. Not to make you happy, but to preserve what feels familiar. A persistent, nameless emptiness. On paper, your life may seem fine: work, finances, relationships. But inside, there's a constant dull ache, as if a part of you has never truly been lived, voiced, or acknowledged. That is the repressed shadow, knocking, asking to be heard. These signs aren't flaws. They're signals from within, a subconscious effort to tell you that something hasn't been healed. And if you're sensitive enough to notice, you're already one step closer to true inner freedom. Remember, you don't need to destroy the shadow. You only need to see it, because once the light of awareness shines on it, the darkness loses its power. That is the beginning of your journey home. Not to become better, but to become real. What happens if you keep ignoring your darkness? The shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. On the contrary, that very avoidance becomes its fuel, making it grow larger and more dangerous. Every suppressed emotion is a form of energy left unresolved. When that energy is not processed in a healthy way, it leaks out in distorted forms: uncontrolled anger, nameless sadness, lingering guilt, and chronic self-doubt. If you keep ignoring it, the shadow won't stay quiet. It will erupt, suddenly and violently, during your most vulnerable moments: a breakup, career failure, or when someone wounds your pride and you won't know what's happening. You'll just feel like you've lost yourself. Worse, you may start to identify with the shadow. I'm just a negative person. I always fail. I'm not lovable. But none of that is true. That's the story the shadow tells you, so it can continue existing. A shadow that's been rejected too long doesn't just cause emotional chaos. It warps the direction of your entire life. You choose the wrong people, wrong jobs, wrong environments, because it all stems from an incomplete self. So the question is no longer, does the shadow exist? But rather, will you continue letting it unconsciously steer your life, or will you learn to enter the darkness, holding a light? That choice doesn't just determine how much control you have over your life, it determines whether you ever truly live as yourself. And nothing is more dangerous than living an entire life without ever truly being yourself. When the shadow becomes the one in control, when the shadow is ignored long enough, it stops being just a rejected part of you. It becomes a covert personality, controlling your behavior, emotions, and decisions. From the unconscious, you still believe you're making choices, but in truth, those choices come from old fears, unhealed memories, and limiting beliefs seated in the past. You think you dislike crowds, but maybe you were once shamed for speaking up. You think you don't need love, but deep down, there's a fear of abandonment you've never named. You think you're emotionally cold, but perhaps you were hurt when you opened up, so you learned to freeze your heart. When the shadow takes over, you begin to identify with your wounds. You can no longer tell what's truly you and what's just trauma. The shadow doesn't have to fight you anymore, because it's become part of the identity you've adopted. You stop living, you start reacting, you stop choosing, you start repeating. And the scariest part, you begin to think it's all normal. You stay in toxic relationships because you believe everyone has to endure pain. You stay in a dead-end job because that's just life. You don't set boundaries because you fear losing love. You don't say no because you fear being disliked. But can you see it now? That's not really you. That's the shadow making choices on your behalf. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And truly, so many people are living this fate, not because they're powerless, but because they don't know they have a choice. When the shadow is in charge, you lose your autonomy, but when you begin to face it, to acknowledge its presence, you start reclaiming the driver's seat of your own life. And that is the turning point of transformation, not through force, but through radical inner honesty. You don't need to defeat the shadow, you just need to recognize who's speaking on your behalf. And learn to speak with your own voice instead. That's when you truly return to yourself. If you want inner freedom, you must first recognize the shadow. You cannot heal what you still deny. And you cannot master yourself if part of your mind is secretly controlling you. That's why recognizing the shadow is the first. and most essential step in the journey toward inner liberation. But how do you recognize the shadow when it has no form, no name, and often disguises itself as normal reactions? In truth, the shadow often appears where you feel unexplained shame, jealousy, pain, anger, or fear. These are moments when the unconscious surfaces, reminding you there's still something inside you that's never been accepted. For example, you feel uncomfortable seeing someone express themselves freely. That discomfort may say nothing about them, and everything about you. Maybe you were once criticized for speaking up, and your desire for freedom was buried. Now, your shadow is resurfacing through resistance. Or maybe you feel jealous of someone's success. But if you look deeper, you might realize you once had the same dream, the same drive, until someone told you you're not good enough. That shadow never disappeared, it just changed form. To recognize the shadow, you need to be honest enough to face the parts of yourself you don't want to admit. Ask yourself, what do I hate in others? What am I hiding in myself? What triggers me most, and why? Not all negative emotions come from the shadow, but every unusually intense emotion is worth observing. It may be the gateway back to a forgotten part of you. The shadow doesn't come to destroy you, it comes to tell you there's a part of you that's never truly been loved. And only when you dare to name it can the light begin to shine into the dark. Freedom doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from no longer being controlled by what you're unaware of. And that begins with one courageous act, looking within, honestly. Two simple yet profound ways to face the shadow. Recognizing the shadow is an important step. But if you stop there, you may end up feeling overwhelmed or self-critical, because when the shadow surfaces, it brings not only suppressed emotions, but also buried memories, pain, and shame. So how can you face it in a healthy, safe way that leads to real transformation? Two methods are widely recommended by depth psychologists, and Carl Jung emphasized them both: reflective journaling and active imagination. Reflective journaling, giving form to the shadow. Writing helps you shape the vague into something visible. Through writing, the shadow begins to take form. It's no longer a blur. It now has words, tone, and context. And you begin to see clearly what you've unconsciously carried. You don't need to write beautifully. Write like you're speaking to the deepest part of yourself. What recently made me feel angry, ashamed, or jealous? Do I have any reactions I can't explain? If the uncomfortable part of me could speak, what would it say? Reflective journaling isn't about solving anything. It's about giving yourself permission to be seen, to be heard, and to be honest. Active imagination. When you talk to your shadow, this is what Jung called active imagination. Picturing your shadow as a separate figure inside you and starting a dialogue. It may sound strange, but it's incredibly effective. Close your eyes. Imagine the part that causes you distress. It could be an abandoned child, an angry woman, or a defeated figure. Then ask, who are you within me? What are you trying to say? What do you need in order to be heard? You'll often be surprised the shadow isn't a monster. It's a part that's been lonely, rejected, and just wanted to be loved, but never knew how. And when you begin to dialogue instead of deny, you open the door to healing. Both methods are challenging at first. They require radical honesty with yourself. But once you pass through the mask, you'll discover something far more valuable than fake positivity: real freedom from no longer running away from your inner truth. And sometimes all it takes is writing down what you've never dared to say aloud for the darkness to begin fading. Not because you're stronger than it, but because you finally had the courage to face it. When you stop running, the shadow becomes your greatest power. There is a paradoxical yet profound truth. The darkness isn't just where your wounds are stored. It's also where your forgotten power is hidden. When you stop running from the shadow, you're not only healing, you're reclaiming a part of your life energy that has long been locked away. Because within every suppressed fear, there lies a yearning for life that has never been fully lived. Within every denied anger, there is a voice that needs to be protected. Within every silent shame, there is a part of you that simply wants to be acknowledged and loved. When you dare to look into that space, what you encounter is not just darkness, but untapped potential. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And it's true, when you dare to step into the darkness, you realize it's not a prison, it's a doorway to wholeness. Anger, when integrated properly, becomes a healthy boundary, and the strength to protect yourself. Fear, when listened to, becomes cautious wisdom. Jealousy, when understood, points toward the authentic desires you've been denying. You may have thought you were weak because of your negative emotions, but the truth is those very emotions carry the codes to bring you back to your authentic self. The deeper you dare to go, the more power you unlock. Not the power to dominate, but the power to live truthfully, without performing, without needing validation, and no longer being swept away by others. When the shadow is integrated, you start responding differently in situations that once triggered you. You no longer need to prove yourself. You no longer panic when you're rejected. You no longer react defensively to judgment, because you've seen, understood, and accepted the parts of yourself that were once cast aside. At that point, you're no longer fighting the world. You become someone who knows who they are and lives accordingly. And that isn't an end. It's a beginning, but this time from within. What keeps most people from ever truly maturing emotionally? Not everyone dares to enter the darkness within. In fact, most people spend their entire lives avoiding themselves. They stay busy, they seek entertainment, they chase goals and build personas, all so they don't have to confront one simple yet terrifying question: who am I when I'm no longer playing a role? And this is why many people never truly grow up. Even as their age and titles increase, their inner world remains immature, fragile, reactive, and empty. Emotional maturity doesn't come with age. It comes from the ability to face your inner truth without running away. But why is this so difficult? Because it demands the death of illusion. You must admit you're not always good, right, or strong as you believed. You must acknowledge parts of you that are selfish, fearful, jealous, disappointed, or weak, the very traits you once despised in others, but now find within yourself. And you must have the courage to see it all, without judgment, without escape, without blame. What prevents people from maturing is not a lack of intelligence or experience, it's a lack of honesty with themselves. They build a socially acceptable self, then guard it like a fortress, but that fortress becomes a prison, keeping them trapped within the limits of the unconscious. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. They'll drown themselves in endless work. They'll blame others. They'll enter relationships that repeat old wounds, all just to avoid the truth, waiting in silence." But if you've read this far, perhaps you're not like the majority. Perhaps you've already started to question the roles, the loops, the old masks. And that is the first sign of true growth. When you stop trying to fix the world outside and start listening to the world within. Not everyone does this. But those who do never live the same way again. Because once you dare to look inward, you can no longer pretend. And from that moment, the journey of awakening truly begins. A shocking truth. Your shadow is not your enemy. In many minds, the shadow, the inner darkness, is something to be eliminated, something shameful, dangerous, and in need of suppression. But this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in depth psychology and a major barrier to healing. The truth is, the shadow is not your enemy. It is a part of you, a part you once abandoned. No one is born all light, and no one is entirely dark. Every person carries within them both light and shadow, the ideal self and primal instincts, compassion and rage, the need for love and the desire to control. When you deny the unacceptable parts, you're denying yourself. You cannot sever part of your soul and expect to feel whole. Paradoxically, the very darkness you once rejected, when illuminated properly, can become your greatest spiritual strength. Within it lies repressed courage, suppressed passion, and a need to live authentically that you never dared to admit. The shadow doesn't need you to destroy it, it just needs you to listen. Imagine for a moment if you stopped seeing the shadow as a monster and began seeing it as a forgotten child. What would you find? Not a demon, but a wounded part of you, screaming for love and protection. It yells, it rebels, it becomes jealous or angry, not because it wants to ruin you, but because it doesn't know another way to be seen. And here's the miracle. When you stop running, stop judging, stop fighting, the shadow stops attacking. It softens, it listens, because for the first time, you are listening too. This isn't the work of a single day, but slowly, As you reconnect with the part of you once left behind, you become a more integrated human being. And you realize light doesn't grow stronger by banishing darkness. It grows stronger when it dares to shine into the darkness and stay there. That's where the truth of who you are is revealed. Not fragmented, not distorted, but whole, deep, and full of life. The rebirth begins when you stop running from yourself, when you begin to look at the shadow without judgment. Something extraordinary happens. Fear dissolves. Not because you've become stronger, but because you've stopped pretending. And once the pretending ends, you no longer waste energy maintaining an image. You can finally breathe for the first time in years. This is the beginning of the inner rebirth. Not dramatic, not loud, but profound and irreversible. You begin to feel lighter when you walk away from toxic relationships, not because the other person changed, but because you've seen the part of you that once feared abandonment. You start saying no calmly, not to fight, but to stand up for the part of you that was once silenced. You no longer need to be kind all the time, likable to everyone, or better to be accepted. You start living by what feels true, even if it breaks molds, even if no one applauds. And in doing so, you touch something precious, something others spend their lives searching for: inner freedom. Rebirth is not about becoming someone new. Rebirth is about returning to who you were before you learned to reject yourself in order to be loved. You'll no longer crave external approval as you once did, because now you've opened the door for the part within you to step forward, the one that used to knock in tears and rage, asking only to be seen. You may still feel fear, but you are no longer a victim of it. You listen to it, walk with it, but no longer let it choose your path. That is the mark of emotional maturity. And you'll realize the most beautiful thing isn't that you defeated the shadow, it's that you learned to walk beside it as an old companion, no longer hidden, because in that once abandoned darkness lies the truest fragments of your being: old dreams, raw emotions, deep desires, unspoken courage, and the gentle light of someone who has finally come home. From chaos to courage. When the shadow becomes your ally, a profound transformation occurs when you stop seeing the shadow as an enemy and start viewing it as a part that needs to be integrated instead of fighting it. You learn to walk with it. And from there, what once caused chaos becomes the foundation of your strength. When the shadow is accepted, all the fragmented energies within you begin to reunite. You feel more present in your choices. You no longer react impulsively, you act with awareness. You stop repeating old patterns. You choose from a place of deep understanding. Anger becomes a healthy boundary. Fear becomes essential caution. Jealousy becomes a compass pointing to forgotten desires. All the emotions once labeled bad become valuable data, helping you understand yourself and shape your life in a more authentic way. You no longer try to fix yourself. You learn to live with your whole self, both light and shadow. And that is the mark of real inner strength. Power doesn't come from perfection, it comes from wholeness. Breaking the stigma, psychology is not for the weak. In many cultures, speaking about wounds, emotions, or inner darkness is still seen as a sign of weakness. Only broken people go to therapy. Strong people don't cry. Just stay positive, don't overthink. These beliefs are not only false, they're dangerous, because they lead people to reject their true feelings and block the path to healing. The truth is, understanding psychology isn't about complaining, it's about growing. Healing isn't a trend, it's a responsibility. And facing the shadow isn't weakness, it's the mark of a strong soul. The weak are those who run from pain. The strong are those who face it and walk through it. Psychology isn't for people with problems. It's for anyone who wants to live real, live clear, live deep, not just survive. And if you're here, willing to face yourself, you're not weak, you're awakening. When you can face yourself, you will discover the meaning of life. We often search for meaning in the external world, career success, love recognition. But eventually, we realize everything outside is just a mirror of what's inside. And if your inner world is in chaos, no amount of external abundance will fill the void. That's why the journey to true meaning doesn't begin with getting more. It begins with coming home to yourself, looking inward, facing the truth, accepting all that you are. When you dare to face your shadow, you stop living as a victim of your unconscious. You become the one who chooses. And from that place, you start living a life of intention, no longer guided by fear, but led by clarity. Meaning is not something distant. It exists every time you live truthfully, every time you're honest with yourself, every time you dare to love the imperfect parts of your soul. Because in the end, the truly free person is the one who no longer hides any part of themselves. And that is where meaning begins. The shadow does not need you to exile it. It only needs you to listen. You don't need to become a perfect version of yourself. You only need the courage to become your real self, with all your light and all your darkness. The shadow didn't come to destroy you. It came to remind you there is still something within you that needs healing. There is still a part of your soul waiting to return. And if you are ready to face yourself without running, without judgment, then the journey of transformation has already begun, not to make you someone else, but to bring you back to who you've always been, whole, free, and fully alive.